Hello, everyone. This is Mary Luehrsen, the NAMM Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations, also head of the NAMM Foundation. And I welcome you to this webinar on music education, keeping music education strong, updates on back to school protocols, funding realities, and advocacy response. We thank you so much for joining us here today. We'd like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded for your review and participation afterwards. Also, we're streaming live right now at nammfoundation.org because our webinar room is full to the brim, which is a wonderful, wonderful reaction to this very important topic, knowing that we need to work together now more than ever to make sure that music education is available for all children as we consider coming back to school and looking at our new reality for learning. First of all, I hope this finds all of you doing well with your families and your community, and that you continue to work to take care of one another and your family. We must be mindful that this is a time where we are all working hard to secure this moment for the people that we care about, which includes children everywhere and the realities of their education. So we're very grateful that all of you are joining us today. And most of all, hope that you are well and that we can continue on this journey to benefit from our collective vision and our collective thinking to solve these problems. A few things I always have to cover at the beginning of these webinars. A quick statement on our antitrust statement. NAMM is operating under a formal antitrust policy, considering prices, margins, price formulas. And if you have any questions about our antitrust policy, it's available for you at namm.org. Don't hesitate to contact. Also, just a bit of a note that NAMM very seriously follows recommendations from the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, and is monitoring the federal and state and local government guidance for both health well-being and for reopening. But it should be noted that this information does not constitute official professional medical, legal, or financial advice, and we advise you to follow those professionals as you need to. So what we cover today, a very important topic as we sit on the verge of states reopening and schools considering what are their responsibilities for the well-being of children relative to return to school. So we need to look at education funding, the state and education funding, and potential impact on curriculum offerings, a very serious subject as states look at the realities of their financing and how it will fund education going forward. The blueprint for school reopening, some states have formally launched some blueprints, and this is a work in progress that we need to keep track of. The potential for Congress response to educational funding realities and advocacy for same, with some breaking news on a bill that has just landed, dropped, as we say in the business, dropped today in the U.S. House of Representatives. More on that as we move on. The professional response to music education and a call for innovation, with our profound thanks to the wonderful team at the National Association for Music Education and their firm representation for the music education profession and their help along the way. We want to take a look at a state, New Jersey, that is working hard ahead of the curve to make sure that these opportunities remain alive and well for students. And we're going to look at a call to action that we all can be involved in. I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed panel that we'll all hear from later. Jeremy Anderson and Lexi Anderson from the Education Commission on the States, Chris Cushing and Connie Myers from our policy advisors in Washington, D.C., Nelson Mullins, Raleigh Scarborough, Bob Morrison of Quadrant Research, also the Arts Education Data Project, Kathleen, Sanz, and Lynn, Tuttle from NAfME. Thank you so much for your wonderful contributions to this meeting that came together very quickly and very important for all of us to be together. We are using the Q&A function on our webinar platform. We invite you to please use that platform. We have a series of follow-ups that we're able to communicate with you for information that's mentioned along the way. Be sure you click send so we can hear from you, and then we'll be giving you some directions along the way as we proceed through the webinar. And we do have a special guest joining us at the end a longtime music education advocate and friend, John Rich of Big and Rich, who happens to be home in Nashville today and was delighted to come on and remind us about how important this work is and how important music education is to every child. So to help kick us off, I'm delighted to have with us Joe Lamond, NAMM's president and CEO, who is also officially the president of the NAMM Foundation. So we welcome Joe, and on behalf of the industry, Joe, we invite you to provide a welcome to all.
Thank you, Mary. Just on behalf of all the NAMM family around the world, I want to welcome everybody here. I want to thank our panelists. These people are dedicating their time and energy to help us all navigate what's up ahead of us. Just a quick thought. This whole thing has been, such a unbelievable time. And the one thing that we cannot let this do, we cannot let this pandemic infect our vision of student-centered education, especially in the music and arts. Thankfully, we have a platform, the advocacy movement, years and decades of all the work of so many of you who are listening today and a part of this in your own communities. We're not starting from scratch here. We have this platform to work with, and I think it can be so effective. And I'm thinking almost that subconsciously, maybe we built this platform just for a time like now, where it's needed so badly to make sure that we can envision our world where every student has access to music education. So while acknowledging the tough and maybe in some cases, in some states, brutal realities, we will go forth with faith and also, as Mary always likes to say, relentless positivity to know that we will get through this and that we will ensure that our vision of a more musical world will come to pass. And so thank you for all your efforts, and we are being called, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you for being a part of this as we move forward to ensure that the student-centered education continues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. As always, we really value your leadership and your words for us today. Well, we need to move quickly to the experts on education policy to help us really understand the state of play and the landscape around us. And I think it's important for all of us to know that there's some really significant resources through the Education Commission on the states. And we're delighted to have Jeremy Anderson, the president of ECS, and Lexi Anderson, the assistant director, that are going to take us through some of the funding and policy realities around back to school. Jeremy and Lexi, I turn it over to you.
Great, and thanks so much for hosting this, and we're excited to be able to share what we're seeing around the states. I'm going to turn it over to Lexi first to talk about some of the state policies and trends we're seeing as states work on rebuilding and opening potentially schools. And then I'm going to talk about, unfortunately, some more dire news around where state budgets are and trends we're seeing there. So I'll turn it over to you, Lexi.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I feel like every time Jeremy and I present together, we usually like to put on the onset, we are not related. We just have a very common last name. We at Education Commission of the States, we've been tracking COVID, specifically how it's related to education policies and sort of where we're seeing states' needs and questions. So we want to go over a little bit first of sort of what we've been seeing, talk a little bit more about how states are thinking about reopening, what legislation we're seeing as well, and then Jeremy will take it back over to talk about some of the budget issues we're seeing. So first off, I want to go over sort of some of the categories that we're seeing as the biggest issues. First off, remote learning was definitely what we saw most asked about early on when schools were closing, sort of what are some of the best practices? How do we ensure equity for multiple populations? And the biggest question of how are we counting attendance and dealing with instructional time? So that sort of leads into the next one with those waivers for assessments and instructional time. We had guidance from the federal government that states could waive assessments for the year, but that's then sort of setting up this bigger issue that we're continuing to get questions on of, how do we tackle grade promotion and student readiness for the next level? Teacher preparation and evaluation. We've got some individuals out there that were getting their contact hours and doing their student teaching, and that has been interrupted. So some states have sort of come out with some thoughts on this and how they're going to move forward. Some are still sort of asking these questions and trying to figure that out. Finance, which we'll hear a little bit later, but has really been a topic of many ECS questions recently. So, we don't really have a ton of information. We do have estimates, but Jeremy's going to get a little bit more into that later. And then student health and wellness, it's definitely been bubbling up to one of the top issues around, providing resources to students who are typically receiving these at school. So many districts do continue to provide lunches for pickup, and they some have sort of started utilizing telehealth options when possible. So I want to move on then to this idea of reopening, and how we've worded it in our resource that we have is this continued and future learning. So how are states thinking about continuous learning and ensuring that we're trying to help students make sure they're up to the next level for grade promotion, but then also how are we going to be reopening our schools? We did find a great resource. It's the American Enterprise Institute released a blueprint for back to school to help states think about, sorry, my light keeps going off because my sensor is behind my screen. My apologies. It's really trying to help students think, or states think through their best practices for reopening schools. So it does take into account some of these underlying assumptions that schools are going to remain closed through spring, which we know that at least one state has, or one or two states have allowed schools to open, and in one of those states, at least one of the districts has started to open for spring to try to at least get some sort of finishing out for the year. And then it's also assuming that we'll need to make some modifications based on guidance that we're getting from national, state, and health officials. Also understanding that accommodations are going to be needed to be made, and especially for those students, administrators, faculty that can't return due to underlying health conditions. There may not be a vaccine for 18 months. So I think with that last one, the thinking is these should not be short-term plans that states are making. These may need to be much longer-term plans, and which could ultimately sort of change the direction of how we're of how we go to school and how we interact that way. The other bullets below some of those are really just considerations that the blueprint says to take into account when reopening schools. So we will share after we present it. I'll make sure I share all those in the chat so that you can sort of read through those. But our resource also that we'll provide at the end of our slides has all of these in there. And we've had multiple organizations providing some of these resources, which has been really helpful. But I wanted to highlight 3 states that have been making some moves on this, and they're sort of on different ends of the spectrum. So Colorado, the Colorado Department of Education administered the district and charter needs inventory from late March to early April. So as of the 15th, there have been a total of 370 respondents. So this is really a way for them to sort of see what these needs have been for the state, which is hopefully going to help them inform what they're going to need when they're moving forward and reopening schools, which so far what we've heard as Education Commission of the States is in Colorado. Some of us have kids. We're really following this much closer, but there is definitely a plan to most likely open schools in the fall. So they found that the top 3 education needs identified were student emotional support, technical supports for remote learning, and online instructional supports for teachers. These are definitely going to continue into the fall, as I think we're going to see much more of a hybrid look at how schools work, and that's going to be an issue to try and figure out how do we serve both students that are coming back to the classroom, but students who are going to continue online, and how do we really build that community for them. For the community needs, they found that the top 3 were identified were that internet connectivity, so having some issues with broadband and ensuring that everyone has actual access to do online learning, food, and then mortgage and rent. So sort of leading in between the students' needs and then needs of some of the parents. And then the inventory really highlights successes that can be used then going forward in supporting students through the summer and reopening schools. So Montana is one of those states that has allowed for schools to reopen. So not necessarily requiring them to open, but they have the ability to do that. And at least one of their districts has started to have students come back, and they're sort of testing the waters on that. And that was as of May 7th. So their plan identifies recovery components. Those are including academics, physical, structural, business function, and then that social, emotional, and behavioral aspect. The plan they have is broken into 3 phases, and we're sort of seeing this as a trend that states are doing things in phases. And that's really to allow the easing of students back into school, not just sort of that bum rush of everyone just comes back to school and we try to do everything's normal, as we know it's not. So last state example is Utah. So the Utah State Board of Education released its 3 phases to recovery guidance. So another showing that trend of phases. So they're identified as address the essential 5, bridge learning gaps, and then return and recovery. So they've identified the essential 5 as continue providing learning opportunities for all students, provide graduating seniors the content they need to transition, maximize opportunities for students to continue to receive meal services, make every effort to keep staff gainfully employed, and then the last, support student and staff mental health and social and emotional needs. So that one is real. That phase is really something they want districts and schools to really be keeping in mind the entire time. They're envisioning that phase 2 would be during the summer months, and it's really a time to begin assessing and addressing learning gaps to bridge the transition to recovery and sort of figuring out how do we get at those learning gaps and how are we going to try to either implement things over the summer or what are we going to have to implement at the beginning of the year for these students that have absolutely had some loss of learning. And then phase 3 is this expected to begin in the fall. So they are definitely expecting to open in the fall, and schools would look to continue to adapt and innovate. So what we are also seeing that we definitely have some other resources within our COVID resource. One of those is actually an Education Next article that is sort of tracking when they think states will be opening their schools, and really the majority are still showing August to September, with 7 or 8 outliers that may open sooner. Again, this is sort of in flux, but at this point, reopening, everyone sort of has their different ideas of how they're doing it. Some already have their plans, they're setting them out. Some are really doing more task forces, right? So they're trying to talk a little bit more about it, bringing all their key stakeholders together before they're making any sort of long-term decisions on that. I just wanted to highlight, lastly, that we are tracking bills for COVID. So you can move to, yes, thank you. So far, we've seen 120 bills that have been introduced. So of those, 36 bills have fully been enacted, and that's over 22 states. That's a large bill count for any of our topics that we see and track over education. So they're sort of ranging different topics, but some highlights include funding, those graduation requirements, grade promotion, remote learning, and that instructional time waivers. So they're definitely sort of all over the map. Some are all encompassing, some are just sort of looking at band-aids that they can fix for this year. But a lot of it is sort of tweaking some of their current policies that they have in place to ensure that we have flexibility for this time. We're going to continue to monitor legislative activity as well and state actions. And so please check out our website to see our bill tracking for sure. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Lexi. So one of the things that our staff of 60 do is we read every bill, every executive order, every governor's state of the state, and we track these things. And so if you've got questions for your state or on a specific issue, let us know because we're happy to assist. I want to go into a little bit of the revenue because we've seen states in 2 categories, responding and then trying to rebuild. And I would say 80% of the states are still in a response mode trying to figure out the school year. We're going to see states start moving into a rebuilding mode like Lexi talked about with her 3 examples. I see more June, July, and they're going to be temporary solutions because some of these are going to require new legislation and the state legislatures won't be coming back until January. So the revenue numbers that I have up here for you are not specific states. We chose these because they give a look across the country from the west to the middle to the east. And if you look, each of these states are looking at some pretty significant changes to what their revenue expectations were for FY20 and for FY21. We also picked these 4 states because they have different tax bases that they are relying more on. Alaska has a lot more oil and gas. Massachusetts has a lot more income. But you can see even with different tax needs that those states have, they're still seeing dramatic impacts. If we can go to the next slide, what we're seeing is beginning to be some states that are showing at least a 10 to 20% loss of revenue. Some states are not going to take action on this until the governor releases the budget in probably November or December for the next year. Some states are already making some cuts. And so just raw numbers that we've looked at from both the Learning Policy Institute and working with the National Association of State Budget Officers, a 10% cut would be about $21 billion for K-12 schools. And a 20% cut across the board for all states would be about a $57 billion cut for all schools. We anticipate that it's next year that we're going to see some cuts, and the year after we're going to see bigger cuts because states will be dealing with these tax issues in the spring of 2021 when the next school year is hopefully already about halfway through or farther. If you can go to the next slide. A couple of the states that we've seen that are taking some interesting actions already, and these are examples of states that are taking proactive actions, whereas some states are just waiting, using rainy day funds and trying to see how long it will go, are Colorado, Montana, and North Carolina. Now, some of these states, Montana and North Carolina, are actually looking at some of the federal funds and some of the state funds and how they're providing that for emergency services in the state. In Colorado, there were a lot of budget cuts that were already initiated and started with the notion that that state doesn't believe that they're going to be able to make it until January to think through where those budget cuts might come from. I wish we had a crystal ball for you to tell you it's this percent that it's going to be down, but you've got to remember we have the April revenue estimates for most states, and that's it so far. Once we get to June, and that's when most states do their annual revenue estimating, we're going to see what this really looks like across the country. And we anticipate it's going to be a 10 to 15% cut needed across the board in most states. One of the things that I'd urge you to do, if we can go to the next slide, is take advantage of a couple of resources that we have that are updated continually. The one at the bottom is our Arts Education Partnership, which is a 25-year partnership that we've had with the U.S. Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Arts. And we have been showing resources from arts organizations and partners of Arts Education Partnership from across the country and what they have for COVID resources. The resource at the top, though, is what our staff is tracking in all 50 states. We update that every Wednesday, and we've now taken all of that data and split it into the major segments of issues that we're seeing and tracking across the country. So I'd urge you to take a look at that website because it'll give you a lot of good ideas on what other states are doing and what you might want to consider. So Mary, with that, I don't know if we have any questions or if we want to transition to the federal side of things.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. Thank you both, Jeremy and Lexi. Two questions. One is from the school reopening. Is it anticipated, without taking a detailed review of all these individual states, that schools are going to look really in combination of in-person learning plus continued online learning? Can we generalize that as one takeaway? Lexi, maybe that's for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think schools and states just need to be flexible and know that this is going to change. Even if we have a plan in place and we come back to school, there could be another closing. We're not sure sort of what's going to happen. So, I think we can plan as best we can and get sort of those policy changes in place that will make that easier. Whether our then planned date stays or it's pushed back further, the better that states can be prepared with policy changes, the better off they're going to be when and if schools are able to open.
Yeah, the concept of a school needs to be arranged around wellness and social distancing. And I've heard some places formulas like a quarter student population coming back at a time, supplemented by online learning. It's just one example, I'm sure. And Jeremy, talking about why state revenues are so important, we know that what percentage of state budgets are actually supporting educational opportunities. I bet you've got that number off the top of your head. What is that? What percentage?
About 48% of the state revenues actually go to K-12 education.
What was that? I think I interrupted
48%. So a very large component. If you add in post-secondary in some states and early learning, it's sometimes 60% of a state budget is being spent on education, as that's usually education and Medicare are the two biggest expenditures for a state. And so when you look at cuts like this, it is almost impossible for a governor to say education won't feel this pain without the governor just eliminating the transportation department or eliminating health and human services, which is not likely.
And which is why we asked you just to kick us off, to be mindful that our states, and as we all move through this time of crisis for many and deep concern for all, that it is affecting our ability for our public service programs, the top half of our state budgets being education. And as we know that when education is under pressure, that our concern for the well-being of children as they experience arts learning is very much part of what we are coming together. All right, I'm going to let you go for our final thoughts later. We're going to move now on to our, thank you so much, Lexi and Jeremy. We're going to move on to our team at Nelson Mullins, because I guess we could say, will we see a cavalry coming across the hill with some relief from the federal relief side for our education concerns? It's really the topic of our request for your input today. Chris, should we start with you, Chris Cushing?
Mary, thank you very much. I'm going to set the policy table here of what's going on in Washington, and then my colleague Connie Myers will kind of let you know what's on the menu here in Washington, at least from the perspective of the House Democrats, who just released, as Mary mentioned, something they're calling the HEROES Act, which others are calling Phase 4 of the federal relief due to the impact of COVID-19 and shutdown of many sectors of the economy. It's an 1,815-page bill with an estimated cost of $3 trillion. And I will admit, we haven't read all 1,815 pages yet. There was a 90-page summary that we were able to get through, and Connie will be talking about the particulars. Mary, if I'm not mistaken, I think NAMM has done 5 separate webinars on federal response to COVID-19, resources for small business, independent contractors, gig workers, and others. So if anyone on the call, and this is at least the largest webinar I've done in terms of participants for NAMM, doesn't know what the CARES Act is or isn't familiar with it, or Phase 3, you can get those archived webinars on the NAMM website. To remind everybody, Republicans and Democrats have joined together both in March and in April to fast track several stimulus measures, totaling jointly about $3 trillion. The Federal Reserve has also stepped up with 2 emergency rate cuts and $2.3 trillion in loans. That was a bipartisan push. It happened very quickly. Not that there weren't problems because it happened quickly, but it was bipartisan. Unfortunately, that honeymoon is now over, at least in the short term. Traditional congressional partisan divisions are beginning to emerge as they look at, is more money needed and how? As we mentioned, the Democrats believe more money is needed. They have an opening bill on the table. And there are some Republicans who also believe that we do need a 4th round of stimulus, particularly to help states and local governments with the massive budget deficits. To date, the money that has gone to states can't do revenue replacement, or localities can't do revenue replacement. They can only be used for the incremental cost dealing with the COVID-19. And Federal Reserve Chair Powell, who's usually very conservative and concerned about deficits, also believes more needs to be done. But Republicans and some in the administration, particularly Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Budget Director Russ Vought, are concerned about the deficits and want to, quote unquote, pause to see how the already approved relief is working its way through the economy. The administration, however, has not ruled out additional relief. You may recall that President Trump in the private sector was very proud he was the king of debt, and he has yet to speak decisively about where he is on the deficits on one side or the other. The bill I mentioned, the HEROES Act, the Democrats dropped just literally 2 hours ago, is going to be voted on Friday. In Washington, we call this a messaging bill. It's going to show the priorities of House Democrats, and frankly, with the Senate back in Washington and working, in the House, most House members not in Washington, they're looking to send a signal to the American people that the House too is responding to their needs. This bill will pass the House with probably little and maybe no Republican support. It is, again, we hope, an opening bid for a compromise next month. So Congress will leave town the end of this week for the Memorial Day recess. They will come back. Hopefully, bipartisan talks will return in the month of June. And again, hopefully, there'll be a bipartisan bill to be voted on and signed before the July 4th recess. Republicans have a reason to negotiate. They're looking for some kind of liability protection for businesses and employers and others who open a business and then, unfortunately, either employee or customer or someone contracts coronavirus. And they're also looking for specific proposals in the restaurant industry, the travel industry, and elsewhere. The president has expressed some skepticism about, quote unquote, bailing out states, that they may use this money for their unfunded pension liabilities, his claiming that those are mostly Democratic states. He's also proposed a payroll tax cut, which has bipartisan opposition. So that's sort of where the state of play is. I'm going to turn it over to Connie now to talk a little bit about what's in this latest bill the Democrats have. And then Mary, I think you want to ask a few questions about what people can do in terms of advocacy on it, and we'll be prepared to talk on that after Connie gives us the rundown. So Connie, I turn it over to you.
Great, Chris. Thank you very much. So just to go back to the CARES Act, which Chris mentioned, which is the third funding bill, it included $30 billion for the Education Stabilization Fund. $13.5 billion of that was in formula grants to the states for K-12. $3 billion was to the governors for education and higher ed, and $180 million was for Rethink K-12 education model grants. Also, the CARES Act provided national emergency education waivers for K-12. And with a waiver, states and school districts can devote more of their federal resources to technology infrastructure to support distance learning for students. All 50 states have now applied for waivers, which will cover the academic year ending in September 30 of this year. So for the next funding bill, Congress is working to address funding for elementary and secondary education to the nation's public schools, to ensure federal support for states and districts. Many of the education groups are requesting inclusion of approximately $250 billion for education priorities for K-12 and for higher education, with at least $150 billion for K-12 and another $50 billion for public education and minority serving institutions, along with funding for other programs. The Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Association of State Boards of Education are urging Congress to significantly increase funding for the Education Stabilization Fund, including increases for elementary and secondary school emergency funds to meet significant educational, health needs, and broadband funding. Congress is working to address support for distance and remote learning for millions of K-12 students that have without home internet access, and additional amounts for higher education students. And on the future funding that takes into account that students may need additional academic, social, emotional, and physical supports as they return to school. Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, who is from South Carolina, is requesting $86 billion for broadband to assist the millions of students and children who currently live in homes with no internet access or who lack any access to high speed connections. He's also emphasizing the needs of students living in poverty and rural communities that are at even a greater risk for access to continued instruction. So as Chris just mentioned, we've just seen HR 6800, the HEROES Act, just introduced in the House, over 1,800 pages. Just a few top lines from our quick review of that. We have found that there's $90 billion for the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. This money would go to Secretary of Education to make grants to the governors of each state for supporting elementary, secondary, post-secondary, and early childhood programs and services. Of this $90 billion, 65% of the $90 billion would go to local education agencies, and $30 billion would go to public institutions of higher education. So on the internet connection piece of the bill, there's $5 billion for the FCC's E-rate for public schools and libraries, for internet service and connection to devices to students and teachers for prioritizing internet access at home. There's $4 billion for emergency broadband connectivity for emergency home connected needs, $1.5 billion for emergency connectivity funds for Wi-Fi hotspots and other devices for students and libraries. And there's also some money in there for $3 billion for child nutrition programs. So for these, addressing the distance learning and keeping the education funding levels very high will be critically important, as we see from this attempt, the first attempt from the Democrats in the House that have put out this bill.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. I just want to think we're having a little problem with advancing our slides, so please hold on for that. We had the letter from the chief school officers. There we go. Our chief school officers, that they have put forward their request to congressional leadership for education funding, and also that this is moving down the pike. It's very interesting, Chris. I want to just emphasize what you said about the honeymoon period. I think it's important to know that the spirit of bipartisan through the CARES Act was pretty strong, was very strong. We heard it coming from both sides of the aisle. Though I think it might be tested now, right, as we move through to look at the Education Act. And we need to unmute you, Chris. We need to unmute you.
Thanks, Mary. Sorry about that. Behind the laws, behind most anything in life, is personalities. And so there are personalities and deeply held beliefs which can be in conflict. So the process we have in Congress is for the House and the Senate to come together with the administration to work out those differences and move bipartisan legislation forward. I think there were only 5 votes against the CARES Act in the House. It was very strongly bipartisan. I think they'll get back to that. There's been sort of a ping pong between the two, between the Senate and the House, is who's going to go first and then who's going to be responsive in this case, because the Senate went first last time, the House is moving first this time. And we'll just have to see, probably again, as I mentioned, next month, how they get back to a bipartisan legislation that can pass both houses and be signed by the president.
Thank you, and I think we can help them with that. I'd like to go to the slide that about the grassroots efforts. One of our calls to action in our time together today is available to us right now at the NAfME Grassroots Action Center, because one of our calls to actions on this call is that we need to urge our members of Congress to address in a bipartisan way the needs of education relative to the funding. Connie, you told us about what dropped today. I think the chiefs are asking for the 200 billion, right? What's dropped is a 90 billion. There's a gap to close. And we have to urge them to come back to the table and to negotiate with one another for the benefit of our children's well-being and all the problems that need to be solved there. So we'll be returning to this when we do our formal call to action, but just be advised that through NAfME's generosity, this is available to you at the NAfME Grassroots Action Center. Enter a zip code. There's a sample email you can send to your member, and we can start beating the drum to bring our leadership together for the sake of our nation's children and education. Connie and Chris, thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Important work. Moving on to our great friends at NAfME, the concept of a professional response from our remarkable music educators that have transitioned to online learning to support students. We've already heard on this call about how state leaders are worrying about the emotional well-being of children at the time that they are feeling disconnected. They literally are disconnected from their learning process.
Absolutely.
Bandwidth issues, and then how our professional music teachers are responding with innovation and concern. So to introduce Lynn Tuttle and Kathleen Sanz from NAfME, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having us on here to have these conversations. We're working very hard to provide not only advocacy ideas and that sort of thing, but how are we going to teach our students distance learning? And so we have some unbelievably creative teachers out there, educators who are helping us to develop some of these different models. And so we've been producing several webinars that have, Mary, just like this one, they've been just overwhelming, the number of people who are asking for some of the assistance from us. And so as we were moving forward, of course, the well-rounded education is just so critical for us to maintain, we have the opportunity in our field to be able to know our students more than 1 year. Oftentimes we're able to have the students that take place they've had them since kindergarten, and so as we're moving forward and that sort of thing, we're looking at some of the whole advocacy piece. How are we doing distance learning? We at some points we've had to encourage our teachers because they're like, oh, I can't do this, and we've really been helping, and people have been reaching out across, and as I say, with the webinars and putting their expertise forward and assisting each other. I think there's more communication going on now between our educators in trying to help all of them. The other thing is actively communicating with the administrators and parents that we can do this, and we are doing this. We are able to provide distance learning in our field of music education, because oftentimes they say, well, that's just impossible, and it's not. And we're proving that it is not impossible, that we're actually doing it and providing some even more creative and innovative ways of doing that. So you know, we're looking forward to that. And as again, the sharing is just unbelievable in what's going on with our association. So as we're returning to school, one of the things we're looking at, will social distancing measures remain in place? We know that they will in many cases. All over the nation, we have, you know, the 50 music education associations, plus Washington, D.C., plus Europe, our European music educators, and you know, so they're all in different places for returning to school. There's staggered days that they're talking about, staggered start times, how many students can be in it. We're working very closely with the National Federation of High Schools, with the College Band Director National Association, with all of the groups working together to try to see how we can go about doing this in a very safe and careful manner. So when we talk about the impact ensembles, that's actually been our biggest challenge, because how are we going to be able to continue that? And there have been, you know, some virtual choruses and bands and that sort of thing, but the public health concerns are real. You know, we're looking so carefully at droplet nuclei. We're looking at aerosol disbursement. And, you know, those are some of the words I don't think I ever would have been using without all of this. You know, yes, I took all my science courses in college, but I don't know that I would. Those are some new words, terms that I'm using almost on a regular basis. So those are some real health concerns, and we're very concerned about our students. But we're also very concerned about our students because of the health aspect and the mental health aspect. So we have some, we're asking people to send any models that they have to assist us and to help our other teachers, and to help the educators be able to, in their formats, be able to move forward with music education. And our standards that have been developed are really apropos for what we're doing now, and that will actually expand, I think, the use of some of our standards, you know, particularly in the creativity and innovation pieces to that. So, you know, kind of going back and looking at the social emotional, we've developed, and you can see this on the screen, we've developed a support for music education and social emotional learning in music education, and how important it is. And again, how often our students have the opportunity to build relationships with other students through these ensemble and through these music courses and music classes that they're actually taking. And so this is a document that's just hot off the press. We worked with the Country Music Association Foundation to do that. And I think, Lynn, you're going to talk a little bit more about some more for the support for returning to school. Lynn?
Great, thanks, Kathy. And again, thank you, Mary, for having us be part of this webinar. One of the other pieces on the social emotional learning and music education that Kathy spoke about at the beginning of her time live here is that idea that we're really blessed as music educators, because we get to see our students over multiple years. So we help with that continuity of care and that connection and that sort of school community build. So not only are we missing our students now, but we know how important it is for them to connect with us, connect with each other through music making. So ways to sort of stay connected and continue to connect with our students and in our schools will be really important as we head back to school in the fall. In addition to that brochure, we've been working across a variety of arts education partners and education associations to come out with sort of a unified statement on advocacy. And you'll see that it begins with that idea that at this moment in time, it's really important for us to be able to talk to stakeholders and policymakers about the role that arts education plays in supporting the social and emotional well-being of all students. Not only do we do that in person really well, but we can also do that, as we've learned, in this virtual space and in online learning. In addition, that idea that we help create and nurture a community and a healthy school environment for all, and that we also help students learn how to express themselves and deal with their emotions in a safe and positive way. And finally, just a reminder that our colleagues, our policymakers, at the federal and state level have already endorsed the fact that arts education should be part of a well-rounded education. And so that is one of the big takeaways here in the statement. The statement is almost complete. We hope to finish it up this coming weekend and to get organizations to endorse and sign off on it. So then this is available for you, for all educators in your communities, arts educators, music education advocates, to use in your conversations with your local school boards, your local superintendents and principals, to remind them about the value that we bring at this moment in time. In addition, just a few very quick pieces that we have available on our website. We have a lovely sort of local advocacy action plan that you can download and fill out, and think about all of the folks that should be part of that community conversation to support arts education and music education in your community. And then just other resources we've got. We, of course, have been working hard to make the case that Title IV Part A funds, specifically the funds set aside for a well-rounded education, can support music and arts education. Got a great toolkit on that. And then one that we call our Civic Action Field Guide, sort of how to engage and with whom to engage in terms of who are the decision makers in education at every level, local, state, and federal. So the role that you get to play not only as a voter, but as on election day, but also as a voter and as a member of the community with your elected officials. And you can find all of these pieces on our web pages, and there's some links there. And again, I think this will be available as a PDF at the end. And then, of course, that Grassroots Action Center campaign right now to support Congress taking action on the state education budgets.
Thank you to both of you. You've done such a remarkable work. I want to make an emphasis on the unified statement and all the people that are working in the background for that. I was on a call with about 60 folks, and I think it's so important to realize this is the dance community, this is the visual arts community, this is the theater community. Maybe just a little bit more about that, Lynn.
Sure.
And how quickly this community has come together, again, to make sure that we have a solid platform on which to talk about this.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, we've been very fortunate in that all of our colleagues are engaged in this work right now, the work of this webinar, this work of sort of supporting music and arts education in the schools. And this idea that we needed to do a unified statement for this moment in time has been bubbling up in conversations, Mary, that you and I have had, conversations our colleagues have been having with CMA Foundation, a conversation that our colleagues in CDA, so the folks who do arts education within state departments of education, were having. And we finally sort of connected all of the dots and started to pull everyone together to have this larger conversation across all of the arts ed service organizations, with League of American Orchestras, with Americans for the Arts, with CDA, with the funding community and the larger advocacy community. So again, just very grateful for the partners engaged in this work and for everyone sort of having that forward momentum and that idea that we need to get this work done quickly so that we have a statement available to get out into the field to support people at the local level as they start to engage in these conversations of what will school look like in the fall.
Thank you. And we'll talk about more call to action. And Kathy, you've been at this for a really important time of your life with wonderful contributions. You're now leading the Florida Arts Alliance. It's so much work with the national and regional work. I almost hesitate to ask this question, but is there silver linings here? Is there, relative to the innovation and the new approach to teaching that you maybe are forecasting or seeing?
Well, I am seeing some, and the silver lining is I do believe we're seeing much more creativity in our classrooms and in our lessons and the educational pieces that are being with the teachers, they're working very closely together. There's a lot more communication taking place. They're helping each other. They're opening up. It's not as a competitive thing as it can be in our field. They are working very closely together and learning from each other. And there are more mentors out there that are willing to step up and help each other. So I think that it would be a silver lining, that they're going to continue that work and continue to work very closely together in the future in all their endeavors and in all their educational aspects for their students.
I know that there's an old-fashioned saying in there somewhere, but I'll think of it maybe during the next segment. So thank you to both of you, and most of all for the great work that you do every day. It would be really the best for all of us if we had a great case history to tell us how this is all working in one place, and there's no one better to help us through this than Bob Morrison, who's helped us and supported these ideas so much along the way. Quadrant Research, also the New Jersey Arts Education Alliance. Bob, we'd love to hear some of your proactive work in New Jersey that maybe we can get some inspiration from.
Great, thank you, Mary, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you and also all the other great presenters you've pulled together on this webinar. I think it's really important. I'm happy to speak to you today about our new reality task force. And I want to preface this by saying I come at this work not only as an arts advocate, but also as a sitting school board member and a board member of the New Jersey School Board Association. So I'm at some tables where a lot of these conversations are going on right now at the highest levels of education. Now, you may think that this name is somewhat odd. Why new reality? Well, we called it that because we're tired of hearing about the new normal, because this is not normal. Next slide. There's nothing normal about this at all. And we cannot pretend that when we return to our schools, that it's going to be normal then either. We have to come face to face with this new reality and prepare plans for how we intend to open our schools and what music and arts education can and will look like. So how will we influence how our schools are open, and what will influence that? Well, for clues, we can take a look at how our businesses are opening, what things are happening there with our businesses. But we also have to think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in this environment, the health and safety and wellness of students, families, educators, and staff must be a priority. Actually, I say must be the priority, because it is the health considerations that trump everything. Next slide, please. So here are some of the common health themes that we are looking at that are consistent with what you heard from Jeremy during his presentation. Some of the main health things that are coming up that we have to pay attention to include, executing temperature checks and personal protective equipment, masks for students and teachers, social distancing. What does that mean for class sizes? How about transportation, busing, and our school schedule, which Kathy alluded to? Testing and contact tracing, schools that are meeting in single classrooms where students will do everything in a single classroom and everything is brought to them. Recess being eliminated or limited, no physical education assemblies or mass gatherings. No parents or visitors in the building, regular disinfection of the building, improved ventilation and airflow, hand washing and sanitizer use and hygiene, student counseling and mental health and mindfulness, and then the preparation for the infections return or the infection return protocol. So these are the health considerations that everyone's going through before we even talk about what are we doing from an instructional standpoint. And along with this, there are some major concerns that we have regarding what's happening. Next slide. First of all, we believe that there are some that will use this crisis as an opportunity to promote other agendas. We've already heard of attempts to narrow the curriculum. We've heard comments from some governors about we need to get rid of our school buildings. We can do this all online. And targeting the arts as non-essentials as quote unquote essential subjects, as well as the potential impact that this will have on student remediation. Now that led us to create this new reality task force here in New Jersey. And this task force is made up of all of our arts education associations and dance, music, theater, visual art, our arts administrators, the Department of Education, our education associations, including school boards, principals, supervisors, educators, parents, philanthropy, our universities, and our state council on the arts. And we've developed a set of key messages that we're focusing on that I want to share with you now. And the first thing is that we've spent a lot of time determining what our expectations are for student learning across all content areas, decades developing our standards and creating our expectations on what children should know and be able to do. Our learning expectations should not change because of this. However, the delivery of our instruction will change, and that's the thing that we need to help people focus on. And that's an argument that resonates very clearly with our education leaders in our particular state, that our learning expectations should not change, but our delivery of instruction very well may. Excellent arts instruction has occurred, as Kathy had alluded to, and social emotional learning must be front and center. So the main message that we're carrying forward in this, next slide please, is to change the how, not the what. We want to be sure that we change the how and not the what, so that we keep people focused on the right things and keep them from tinkering with stuff that they shouldn't be messing around with right now. So as part of that, we've got a plan that we're working on called September Ready. And the September Ready plan that the task force is working on is really set up where we have subgroups within the task force to address discipline-specific areas. That they will identify and recommend best practices from their recent experiences. They will to the health themes that we talked about, that they'll look at considerations by grade configuration and content area, and that they'll include new ways to engage students. That we'll recognize the critical role that both in-person, asynchronous, and synchronous learning will take place for our students. That there needs to be a combination of all of these in this new blended learning environment when our schools open up, because we will not all be together all at the same time. And we have to embed social emotional learning into our instruction. Here in New Jersey, we've developed a SEL and arts framework that a task force has been working on for the past 18 months that we'll be releasing at the beginning of June to help assist educators with the embedment of SEL into music and arts learning. It's one of our superpowers that we have, and it's a secret weapon that we can use toward the implementation of SEL in our classrooms. And we have to be prepared for a new COVID outbreak. With continuity of instruction. There's all education agencies are looking at how do we move from when we come back together to when we have to be apart again, in case we have another outbreak, either in our individual buildings, or if we have this outbreak in a region and entire regions are shut down. So some things to think about is that as music educators, we have to have solutions for our administrators. When our administrators say, this is how we're going to operate in the fall, we need to come back to them and say, we have a plan. And that's what our task force is working on, designed to help develop these plans to help our constituents with solutions for their administrators so they can be a part of the solving the problems in our school districts as we prepare for this new normal, this new environment, this new reality that we will face when our schools come back together this fall. And we have some links and materials that are available on our website at artsednewjersey.org/COVID-19, including information on distance learning, social emotional learning, our new art standards, and the work of our task force and our September Ready plan. And of course, you're welcome to email me at bob@artsednewjersey.org. So again, thank you, Mary, for the opportunity to address this, and hopefully this will be helpful for folks as they attend to their work in their own states.
Bob, you've given us a great example of actually a coalition that came into motion, right? I mean, you just put this coalition together. I loved your quote here. Your quote, our job is to take the solution to our administration, not to rely on our administration to give the solution to us, but to use our network and our resources and the help we're here to give one another to take these solutions to our administration. And I think we've gotten some tips into that. Bob, I'd like to ask you one question.
Sure.
throughout this entire presentation so far, and I want to add that there's been a lot of Q&A. We're going to download these and provide a Q&A document, all right? So we can really answer all of these. We haven't been able to keep up with them, and that's because we have a very smart audience here. Why does social emotional learning matter so much now? Why is that the cornerstone on which we need to build this advocacy forward?
Well, I think it's always mattered. I don't think people have paid attention to it as much or to the degree that we are now. I think that the body of research has really brought forward the impact of social emotional learning on childhood development, the way students learn. And that, I think, has been a critical component of this. And the fact that, you know, the arts and music, you know, have social emotional learning embedded. It is one of our superpowers. And it's because the arts, by their very nature, are social, right? And when you think about it, the arts are also very emotional, whether you listen to a piece of music or you observe a piece of art or watch a play. So it is inherent in the arts, these social emotional learning aspects. And we can embed it in our instruction just by being intentional about it, just by thinking about the intersection of SEL with the particular instruction that we're delivering. And by just opening that aperture a little bit, we can be that much more effective in activating the SEL environment, connecting with our students, and making a meaningful contribution to their well-being in this very, very challenging time.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks so much.
Thank
So
you.
I want to thank you. I want to spend a moment with all of you with our two very distinct calls to action that we're providing. And then after this, we have the great privilege of having John Rich with us. But we have two very distinct calls to action that we want everyone involved in our network, our support music network, our NAMM members, all of our partners. We want to urge Congress to adequately fund education in this part of the COVID-19 relief packages. We have this link available at NAfME.org and their advocacy, their grassroots action center, but we collectively need to urge our members of Congress to advance needed relief for education so funding in states can remain reasonably strong, that we don't have erosions of these well-rounded opportunities for our children. And the other one is more personal to each one of you, is I urge every music education stakeholder, and that's all of us, that we are all meeting with our local leaders and elected officials to assure that planning for the school reopening includes music and arts education, which is the heart and soul of student learning. Bob has given us a great example. We've got great resources available from our partners at ECS and NAfME. We are, and at the NAMM Foundation as well, we're surrounded by remarkable examples, but we all need to take the step forward to have these conversations and to be a resource for solving the problem as our schools are reorganized in the fall. And most of all, we want to hear about your activity, and we want to be a resource to understand what you're doing so we can share this work that you're doing. We know that a solution starts with a conversation. A solution starts with something you are concerned about. A solution starts with something that you can contribute to managing the problem and managing the opportunity for children to have this rich and deep music and arts learning. And we know that now it's more important to our children than ever before. So what you find, what you're doing, we want to hear from you at advocacy@nafme.org or to Eric E. at NAMM.org, our great senior project manager. So with that, I'd like to bring John Rich on, make sure he's got a camera on somewhere. John, are you with us? Hey, John, I can hear you. Welcome.
Yeah, it says the host hasn't asked you to start your video.
Well, we're going to work on that. And there you go. Hi, John Rich.
Hey, what's up, guys? I've been listening the whole time. Thanks for inviting me.
And I saw that you were on the whole lot. You've kind of got an earful of policy and the great work that's happening in the field. So, John, you've been a wonderful spokesman for music education for a good long while. Why is this experience so important for children everywhere?
First of all, thanks for inviting me, excuse me, to be on. You know, music it's interesting. I think it's not something that, unless you have experienced music in your life where you're maybe making it or involved in it in one way or the other, or the arts in any fashion, really, you don't necessarily understand it. You know, there are a litany of X factors that go along with music education. Growing up, a little background on me, I grew up in Amarillo, Texas, which is in the middle of nowhere, basically, in a double wide trailer, you know, nothing fancy. We weren't missing meals, but we didn't have anything extra to go on. And I remember specifically in about 5th, 6th grade, wearing a pair of hand-me-down tennis shoes, or actually dollar store shoes, like they were somebody else's shoes before they were mine. And I wore these shoes to school. And I remember a couple of kids making fun of my shoes because they could obviously tell I was proud of them, but they could tell, oh yeah, he's wearing used shoes. And they you know, would make comments about that. And these kids were also in our school band. And I was in that band. I was playing trumpet. And so music, one of the X factors to it is it is a great equalizer amongst people. And I remember those same kids that were that actually played trumpet with me in that school. I was first chair because I practiced harder than they did and could blow a high C. And they were like 4th and 5th chair. So I'm like, yeah, you don't like my shoes, but you're in 4th and 5th chair. I'm first chair. Deal with that. So the confidence that it brings to a kid is immeasurable. You know, I would compare it with sports for a minute. Let's talk about that. Sports programs are extremely expensive. Now, how many kids in school actually have the physicality, stamina, athletic ability to actually make a team in a school? Very few kids actually make the team and can do that. But music, on the other hand, anybody can learn how to play an instrument or sing or be in a play. Any kid can participate in that. And, you know, I've heard a lot today about, you know, people that don't have internet, for instance. You know, if they don't have that, they don't have a lot of other things. I can promise you that. And the great thing about music is that you don't have to have a football helmet and a bunch of pads or whatever. It's an instrument that has probably been at that school for 30 years. And now it's your instrument while you're in that school and you get to learn from it. You know, I heard a gentleman talking about, you know, learning music opens the kid's mind up into their other subjects. That's a fact. You know, there's a lot of math in music. You know, you talk about 3/4 time or half time, or you want to look at a 1 note and a 5 note and how those things go together and make harmony. You know, that unlocks things in your mind that helps in other subjects. But I think the problem is Republicans and Democrats, people in DC, they really don't understand what that means. And, you know, they all think sports is important. And I agree. I have 2 sons that are 8 and 10. They play sports. I think sports are important. But I think to take away music from American kids going to school, I would propose that back to Congress. And I would say, how about this? How about I turn your radio off and your Sirius XM and your Pandora and your Spotify, and no more music for you. You don't get to have music in your life. You're just going to hear the weather and the news, and that's it. You think they would like that? I don't think so. There would be a revolt if you took away America's music. You can't have music anymore. But look at these kids. These kids are already struggling, and now they're in this crazy situation going forward. And to take their music away is taking away more than just, oh, okay, well, maybe this kid will just have to go through life and not know how to play a C scale on a trombone. No, it's a much bigger conversation than that. And that's what our government needs to understand. We've got to make them understand that. I'm a living example of that. I'm a high school graduate. I'm nothing fancy, but I am an American dreamer. And I did practice very hard, and I studied on what I wanted to be good at, which was music. And it's done well with me. I've done well with it and have passed it along to a lot of other people. And I've seen it not only change the lives of me and people around me, but people who have heard my music, certain songs I've written. You know, it's just tidal waves of people that have come in over the years that have told me how my music helped them out in one way or the other. And had I not had a school that taught me a little bit about music and gave me something to stand on, I'd probably be herding cows in Amarillo right now. I wouldn't have had the same life. So I think it's really incumbent on all of us, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, somewhere in the middle. This is the one time that we can leave our weapons out in the parking lot. This is not anything that should be debated, in my opinion. We can debate every other subject we want, but music, man, that's a gift. That comes from the boss. That comes from God. And he gave all of us a love of music. Whether you wind up being a professional musician or not, every kid should have the opportunity to at least engage in music. I remember going to school, and I didn't want to go to school. I'd rather be somewhere else. But one of the only reasons I went to school or, struggled through it, because I knew at the end of the day, I was going to be able to pick that trumpet up and read some music and learn something new and be able to play. It's the same reason kids think about sports the same way. But I'm telling you right now, music is such a wider, the arts is such a wider path for more people to walk down than sports is. It's just a fact. And I think we've got to make our leaders understand everything I just said, which is just said in very common language. But I think if we can get them to get that through their heads and understand it, more emphasis and more support will come in a bipartisan way. And everything that's been said on this call, like I said, I listened to the whole thing, and there's a lot of great ideas on here. And I can tell everybody is doing what they can do in their skill sets, which is exactly what it takes to do. And so I'm encouraged by this phone call. And, I would urge everyone to stay the path, stay the course, and explaining these X factors to them. Like what I just heard right before I came on, we're talking about, I think you called it the way it socially affects them and emotionally affects them. Yeah, that's all true. Put it into a package where they go, well, I never thought of it like that. Yeah, we're concerned about, 22 kids on a football team, but what about 600 kids? What about a kid that's disabled? What about somebody that, 5'2", 100 pounds soaking wet that's never going to be on anybody's sports team? What's that kid supposed to do? Well, a lot of times they do music unless you take it away from them. So you can tell I'm passionate about it. I know we're in an unprecedented situation, but I think more than ever, this is when we have to make our case as to why this is important and why it must continue to be supported.
John, thank you so much. We can hear your passion. About 12 years ago, I was at an event with you, and I'll remind you of something you said. You said, what education needs is 8 things. Do you remember what you said?
Oh, probably not exactly. Go ahead and remind me.
It needs do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do.
That's right. I did say that. Yes, I did.
You did say that, and it stuck into my mind, which is why we're grateful to have you today.
Well, think about, just in closing, think about when a teacher, an English teacher, a history teacher, teaches their students the presidents of the United States or the prepositions or whatever list. You know what they always do? They put sing. Melody to it. Right. They put melody to whatever that thing is they want them to memorize. And why is that? Because melody comes natural to all of us. And it puts it deeper into your subconscious and your conscious. You learn it better when there's melody attached, and it's fun to learn it that way. I mean, music is an absolute necessity to a human being. It's like I said, if you told America, tell Congress, we're going to turn your radios off, no more music for you, they wouldn't be real happy about that. People look forward to music. It makes them feel better. It lowers their stress. It inspires them. It makes life better. And if you take it away, the converse of that's going to happen, and we can't let that happen.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. And I know you can't wait to get out on the road, right? There will be a time again when you'll be with all those wonderful audiences. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Really great to have you. A quick update, turn on everyone's video as we're going through a quick resource update. A lot of things available for you at NAMM and NAMM Foundation. We have materials about taking care of your instrument hygiene. There's information on a summit that we're having on June 16th, which will be available to all. We have a virtual choir experience. John Rich, you should look into Virtual Choir 6 and join that online. It would be great. Our CDC reviewed partnership with NAfME and the Federation of High Schools on instrument hygiene. Piano care is also available. Tips for employee health. This probably crosses over to things that are happening in schools as well. Our Make Music Online webinars are available to you all. And I just would like to do a quick round robin of our panel. Also, our NAMU webinars on restore openings, but a quick round robin with our panel in terms of some final thoughts. And I go first. Let's go with our ECS folks. Jeremy, start with you.
Yeah, I would just urge you to be in contact with your elected officials and ed policymakers. We are in the middle of a global pandemic and an economic crisis. No one in those positions planned for this. So be in touch with them, share with them the value of what you're bringing and why you want to make sure that this gets saved. And just understand, if they've got a 20% cut and they make it so it's only a 6% for some of the programs that we're near and dear to, that may be the best that they can possibly do.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for being with us. Chris Cushing?
Yeah, Mary, you mentioned at the start sort of, well, collective action. And there's an old saying, none of us is as smart as all of us together. And we learned so much from the comments and things in the webinar. Every person can make a difference. Every person has 2 senators and a congressman. They can contact them. We'll be back with more specificity on how to do that and some messaging points. I was very impressed with the messaging points that Mr. Rich had. Those are things, frankly, I had not thought of, but it makes a very compelling and passionate presentation. I'm sure everyone on this call has the same passion for music and can express that to their elected officials, and we'll urge them to do so.
Connie Myers from Nelson Mullins, final thoughts? Connie? Maybe she's not with us. All right, we'll jump to NAfME. Kathy Sanz.
I just say for everyone, be at the table. You have to know what's going on. You have to, if they're talking about it in your school, how they're going to reopen, you've got to be part of the discussion. And so be at the table.
Lynn?
Agreed, Kathy. And remember, we can be part of the solution, right? We know these students. We've worked with these students for multiple years. We have solutions to bring forward and to be part of what's going to support these students in the new reality come fall.
Thank you. Connie, we'll go to you. Your final thoughts.
Again, Mary, our members of Congress are so important, and our elected officials, but our governors are equally as important. And with the Education Stabilization Fund, they will be making many of the decisions. So contacting the governors will be extremely important as well.
Be at the table. Be at the table, right? Bob Morrison, we set quite a table in New Jersey. Your thoughts?
Two quick thoughts. One, first of all, when I heard John Rich talking, I was channeling Jerry Seinfeld, no music for you. I think that's definitely something that we can carry forward. But all kidding aside, and I know that this is a challenging time for everyone, and there's a lot of heavy things that we've talked about. I believe that there's an opportunity for a real renaissance for music and arts education. We just have to open our minds and think creatively. That I can't wait to see what our educators come up with in this new environment. And I think that we have the opportunity to expand our influence and bring in more students into music and arts education than we had up to this point in time. So it's not all dark. There's some great opportunities out there. We just have to open our minds and lenses to see it.
That's great. Thank you so much. I see Joe Lamont is still with us. Joe, would you like to come on and share final thoughts?
You guys have been fantastic. All I'll say is times change, but I don't believe fundamental human behavior changes. Don't bet against fundamental human behavior. Music is part of our DNA and always will be. Don't bet against that. I'm with all you guys.
Thank you, Joe. If we could go back to our call to action slides, just want to put that top of mind to everyone. Remember, we are in this to urge Congress to adequately support education as we go forth in our next relief package. A great grassroots resource available at nafme.org. We'll be sure that you have that in front of you. And as we've been reminded over and over on this call, we must be at the table. One of my favorite sayings, if we're not on the bus, we're under the bus. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. And it's our job now to be a resource to solve the problems of our schools coming together, to have student-centered advocacy for the role of music and arts in well-rounded and whole learning for all children. And I really believe we can make a tremendous contribution to, as John Rich, the music will not turn off. We're going to turn up the volume for the opportunity for every child to have the right to learn music. So thank you all so very much for being with us. I know we've had a long and rich webinar. It was a very, very important topic, and I'm so grateful to the remarkable panelists that we've had on this webinar. Very, very important. To all of you, thank you. Be well, be safe, and as the famous line of the time is, we will meet again. See you soon. Bye-bye.